Good, everyone. Welcome to our latest Econ Talk. We've almost been holding off doing this for a little while, given how much chaos has been in the world. We sort of hoped that we would have a clearer view of what was happening out in the economy and what's happening globally. But unfortunately, Gareth, that uncertainty remains pretty heightened. We've seen conflict emerge in the Middle East. It was a couple of weeks ago now. It feels like almost a lifetime ago in the economic landscape. Airstrikes by the US and Israel against Iran and retaliation from Iran across the Middle East to a number of Gulf nations. That's continued not only to strike, mainland areas and a number of military installations, but increasingly some more populated areas and energy infrastructure. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. There's now very little that's moving through, given the threat of missile strikes and drone strikes, and that sent the cost of oil soaring. Brent crude is now over $100 US a barrel. At points, it's sort of pitched up to 115 or so for short periods before coming back, but significantly, when it was below 70 US a barrel before the conflict emerged, the pressure is absolutely on. We've seen the likes of 91 petrol here in New Zealand increase to about $3.14 a litre. Last I checked, Gaspy, I think that was up something like 56 cents a litre over the last week or so. Diesel's gone even further, up $1 a litre over recent times, and the hit's really coming through there. There's an enormous amount happening, Gareth. I mean, what's the immediate sort of couple of shocks we're watching for in the economy in terms of how this Middle East conflict is starting to affect us and the economy here at home?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, there's the direct impact of those higher fuel prices that you've talked about on households. Consumer confidence, we already know, was relatively fragile. Consumer spending has been, struggling to grow, particularly. And so we're expecting that to have a pretty significant negative impact as people go, wow, I've got to spend more filling up the car, and they have less money for other goods and services. So what was already looking like a pretty fragile economic recovery, that's a hit to it, given that households hadn't been feeling that happy with the cost of living anyway before this came along. The other sort of, I guess, second key aspect of that is, what does it mean in terms of those higher fuel prices for all the other goods and services throughout the economy? Everything that has to be transported, whether it's domestically or internationally, those costs are going up. We were already talking about an environment for businesses where they were more willing to pass cost increases on anyway. So we know transport costs will be higher. It's then, what do the firms who have to use those transport services do with the cost of their goods? And we expect that to rise as well. So much for inflation going back down towards 2% later this year. That's now really looking like it's off the cards. And all of that stuff I talk about on the basis that we actually can continue to get fuel into New Zealand. It's a whole another ball game, I think, really, if we have this strait shut for an extended period of time, and you start to run into issues where there's actually not enough fuel around for everyone to be able to do everything they want to do, and you start to see sort of rationing or shortages coming through. That would cause even more significant negative impacts across the economy, because economic activity would be hit beyond what we've talked about in terms of those flow-on effects from high fuel prices already.
So I guess when we're looking at that, I mean, inflation now, we're sort of more picking it to head to the sort of high 3% mark, if not hit 4% before the end of the year. Again, sort of hoping it's part of that temporary shock. But one of the biggest parts of uncertainty at the moment is no one knows how long this is going to go on for. Oil prices have actually increased by slightly less than what they did after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But the concern is this doesn't look like it's stopping anytime soon. Whereas for the likes of that oil price shock, you did see that, flows of oil started to adjust a bit more over time. They're not going to under current circumstances. For the likes of New Zealand, we know that most of our fuel that we get is refined in the likes of South Korea or Singapore, and that they get their crude oil from the Middle East, or they used to. And like you say, that question is, well, we've got sort of 30-ish days worth of fuel in the country. We've got more on the way from the last shipments that made it out of the Strait of Hormuz and then to the refiners and eventually down to us. We're monitoring the data that government is putting out on that, but the question does remain, and we're getting it from businesses already. is there going to be enough fuel for me to keep my operations going? Or is there going to be some sort of prioritization, some rationing of fuel that means I can't do as much economic activity? I don't have the, all of the fuel to, power my tractor. I don't have enough fuel to, move my construction workers around to have those big, heavy bits of equipment that are building new roads or similar continue operating. So the hit there is sort of on that productive side as well. I mean, looking through all of this, what is the Reserve Bank to do when you hit an oil price shock, and how different is it, given that we're starting from an already challenging economic environment, but also a higher priced environment that we might have been comfortable with?
Yeah, the orthodox thinking about your oil price shock normally is because households have less money to spend on other goods and services because they're using all that money to fill up the car, it has a sort of disinflationary effect across other parts of the economy because there's less demand and firms are not able to charge as much. But you're right, we're starting in an environment where there was already inflationary pressure in the system anyway, despite the fact we had spare capacity across the economy and we haven't grown for the last 3 years, particularly. So the Reserve Bank, I think, is in a more difficult situation than they would normally be, and they may well have to react in terms of lifting interest rates to try and counter some of those second and third round effects, particularly given how massive that lift in sort of oil, petrol prices, diesel prices in particular, has been over the last few weeks. There's, for me, a real risk of those flow-on effects being quite considerable. So it's quite a balancing act they have to do there because, if they lift rates, people will be going, well, the economy is stuffed. It's got this, knife in its back from higher oil prices. Why are you further constraining growth? We've got to remember Reserve Bank's primary target is keeping inflation over the medium term under control. And yes, they can look through a short-term spike because of oil prices, but it's how persistent some of those other effects are afterwards that keep inflation high later in 2026 and out into 2027.
And we've already seen a little bit of that, right? Wholesale interest rate swaps have increased over the last wee while. I think last I looked, sort of over the last month to mid-March, you'd seen something like a 20 to 35 basis point increase in swap rates between the sort of 2 and 5 year terms, and that has prompted a number of retail banks to lift their mortgage rates as well. So there's already a bit more of that in the system. Market pricing seems to be consistent with expecting a raise in September, and I think that sort of market's almost hedging their bets between what you've just said. On the one hand, inflation too high, about to get higher, uncomfortable, needing to raise, but also not enough economic activity happening, weaker sort of economic circumstance, Reserve Bank not wanting to sort of cut that recovery off at its knees too quickly. So a very, very difficult balancing act. And let's be clear, a very challenging one in terms of, again, the certainty that might we almost want and need coming forward that just won't appear anytime soon. Even if conflict decided to end, right this second, it would take still a good month or so before all of those sort of all supply chains started to get back and operating. You've got to repair a lot of bombed out equipment. You've got to get ships back in the right location. You've got to start to restart some of those manufacturing production facilities in the Middle East. And then you've got to get it on ships down to South Korea and then to little old New Zealand. So again, the sort of hit is huge. And I sort of feel like it's more, at the moment, a multi-month event rather than sort of a short-term couple more hours. We've already been going a couple of weeks at this point, and it doesn't look like there's any particular change in sight. And that does mean the economy is in a tougher place. Let's leave it there because, my goodness, there's a lot that we could try and unpack even further, and I fear we'd almost just go round and round in circles. We are monitoring a lot more of the data that's coming out on a short-term basis from government and others, and we'll continue to assess what that means for the New Zealand economy, and we'll update that on one of our future Econ Talks.